Hey, this is Steve Halleck again with TikToking.com. You can find me on Instagram at Steve Halleck, SteveHallock, to see all my fresh catches. And of course on the website, www.tiktoking.com, and you can see all the cool pieces that I find. All right, well today I have a really special piece. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is the Richard Mille RM004. So this is one of the original Richard Mille pieces, and the brand started, of course, with the tourbillon with RM1 and then RM2, and then the other piece that he had envisioned his brand always having was the split second, which is the RM004. Now, split second chronograph is basically the hardest complication to make nowadays, with maybe only a minute repeater in the same league. You know, there's no way to really mass produce a ground up rattrapant, which is the word for split second. You just have to, it's a tremendous amount of parts and adjustment and skill to achieve it, and that's why you see so few of them. I mean, you've got the, obviously Patek makes a nice split second, but even they have only had a fully in-house split second chronograph for a couple years now. There's the Longa double split, and you know, the list is very short. Most of the other ones are built on Ibauches, and then, you know, historically, of course, you've got the Lemania split seconds and a couple others. Actually, there was a really good article on split seconds on Hodinkee a little while back, so if you're interested, check that out. But anyway, this was back when Richard Mille was making all of their movements with Renaud and Papi, who is of course partly owned by Audemars Piguet, and maybe the best complications makers on the planet. And so they made this incredible split seconds chronograph. You can see the movement is insane. So these actually came out very slowly. They were announced, but sort of trickled out, and the rumor was always that the movement was way more difficult for them to make than they actually thought, and that all of the RM4s ended up being actually sold at a loss, because they kept the retail price the same always, even though they were jacking up the tourbillon retail prices. So I think they probably made good money on the 8s, and you can see, you actually see more 8s on the market than 4s. The 8 is exactly the same as a 4, but it adds a tourbillon also, and they were about 3 times the retail price. But these 4s are very rare, and this happens to be a particularly special piece in that it's platinum. And the platinum RM4 was never officially produced. It was special ordered only, and according to a source that I have who's very close with the brand, they made only 3 of them. So you're pretty much not going to see another one of these ever. So let's talk about that case first of all. If you've watched my other Richard Mille videos, you know that I love the RM tonneau shaped case. It sits perfectly on the wrist. It's super comfy to wear. The 4 is maybe my favorite size. It's a little bit bigger than the early 2s and 5s. It's kind of maybe a little bit bigger than the 10, but it's got the extra screws, and it's sort of, I think to me, where Richard Mille really found their stride in terms of case dimensions and amounts of screws and stuff like that. I had a 4 a long time ago, one of the original pieces, and at the time they only had the crocodile and leather straps. Having a rubber strap for this watch is a huge improvement. I love the way that it goes into the case perfectly. It's like a seamless fit. And with this platinum case, of course the case is pretty heavy, but the RM strap design is so good that it really anchors the case well. It almost feels like you have a bracelet. So the weight isn't too heavy or too centered on top. One of the things that I love about the precious metal Richard Mille cases is I really love this interplay between the brushed finish on the top and the sides and the polished finish on the edges. It just adds something really special to it. And I think that actually the precious metals really go well with the ethos of Richard Mille, which was to make a luxury item but bring in new technologies and racing and stuff like that. You know, it's a racing machine for the wrist. So for me, I kind of prefer the precious metals to titanium. I also like the composites. I think those are really cool and kind of go the other direction. but you know, those are just my preferences. So anyway, let's get into the actual workings of this thing. A split seconds chronograph, basically, you can think of it as like one of the uses would be to time lapse or something like that. It's you can time 2 segments of a thing, basically. So at first it just works like a normal chronograph, although in this case the buttons are placed differently. Like a normal chronograph, you would have your start-stop there and your reset there. In this case, this is the split button, this is start-stop, and this is reset, which actually was pretty well thought out. You can think of like when you have the watch on the wrist, your thumb naturally goes here, and that's a really great place to have your start-stop and your reset up there, and then if you want to split, you can just hit it there. So let's give it a start. There's a patented mechanism in this watch that helps not have jump when it does start, so that's really nice to have in a chronograph. And you can see the button is really nice, smooth, and then very crisp at the engagement. So we can let that run for a second. And you can see, I think you can see, let's try to zoom in here, that the tip of that chrono hand is white and red. And in fact, it is 2 chronograph hands that are one on top of each other. So you can see the red is a little bit higher than the white. And then watch what happens when I split them. Let's go so we don't confuse it with the minute hand. Let's do it here. Boom. So the red one stops there, the white one keeps going. So now if you were timing something, you could note, okay, good, the first lap or whatever, you know, it was 37 seconds, we'll call it, and now the thing is still going, so we can join back up with the original hand and keep timing. And if we want to split it again, and join back up. So it's pretty cool in that way. Then we stop it over here and reset it. Both hands will reset together. Okay, so other functions, we've got, of course, a second hand down here, running second. On the RM8, the tourbillon is right under here. It's probably not my favorite of the Richard Mille tourbillons. I'd kind of rather have a 4 and a 2 for the same money, only because the watch looks almost exactly the same as a 4. You can barely see the tourbillon because it's here under the seconds hand. So we'll stick with the 4 for now. Here you notice the H, N, and W. This was one of the early things that RM came out with, and it made it, you know, again, a little bit more like a racing machine. Right now the crown is in neutral. You can move it, it does nothing, like neutral in a gear selector. If you pull it out once, it goes to W, which is wind. So if we wind it up, you can see up here is our power reserve. And we've got that going. Now, this watch has another function that I've mentioned before in some other reviews that I really love, and that is when it's fully wound, it has a mechanism that decouples the crown from the winding, so you can't overwind it. When you get to the end, you just sort of feel it skip, and that's really nice. As somebody who's you know, had some experience overwinding and getting himself a hefty repair bill, that's great. Over here, you have another indicator that was unique to RM, which is a torque indicator. So this shows how much torque is in the mainspring. As long as it's in that range, you're good to go. And the way that they've structured the power reserve makes it so that it's almost always in that range, as long as it's pretty well wound. But when it gets down here, you know, to maybe 20 hours left or something like that, you'll see the torque indicator dropping down and out of that kind of perfect range, and you'll know to give it a bit of a wind. So if you pull it out one more time, you can see it goes to hands, and that's, of course, how we set it. So just to see some cool details, this bridge up here, if we can get a focus on it, is pretty amazing. Of course, all these parts were unique to this watch, and this came out, you know, fairly early on. This watch, I think, came out in about 2002. Maybe the first couple pieces were delivered, maybe 3. And so this was just wild watchmaking at the time. Now, of course, lots of people have copied it, and Richard Mille has even sort of copied themselves and are now doing a bit of a different thing. But this is back when this brand was really doing super special stuff. So let's look at the back. The movement on this watch is incredible. It's right up there with the datograph, the double split, the Patek split seconds, all these movements that are considered the sort of most beautiful to look at. You can see the depth, trying to get focus there, and just all these pieces and bridges crafted in this kind of motif of a racing machine, and it's just really spectacular. Now there was a V1 of these which had a titanium base plate, and very few were produced because they had a bunch of upgrades to the movements, and so they came out with the V2s early, which included a carbon base plate, which you can see how that's there's some like grain in it. It's actually carbon. The entire base plate is a piece of carbon. And if you look at the movements side by side of V1 and V2, you can see a lot of differences in, especially in the bridges, you notice immediately with a bunch of improvements that they made. Just to die for, huh? All right, so let me put it on the wrist and you can see what it looks like. It's got this spring-loaded deployant that Richard Mille likes to use. Again, it's nice for the heavier watches to have something like that. It really keeps it nice and secure and distributes the weight quite a bit. So you can see that it's, it's obviously not a small watch, but because it doesn't have any lugs and it's curved, it kind of fits pretty perfectly on the wrist. The weight's very nicely distributed with this rubber strap and the deployant. And boy, not a lot of watches better than that in the world. So there you go, that's the Richard Mille RM004v2. This one happens to be in platinum, and I hope you enjoyed this. This is a killer watch.